The night sky above the alien world was wide and endless, filled with two moons that cast a pale glow across the land. Ethan Walker, a young human explorer, had never seen a place so strange yet so beautiful. He had not meant to crash on this planet. His ship had been pulled out of orbit by a storm of magnetic waves, sending him down into a wild and untamed land. Now, days later, he wandered through broken valleys and forests of tall, crystal-like trees. Their branches shimmered like glass when the wind moved, filling the air with soft, ringing sounds. Ethan's food supplies were running low and his communicator was broken. Every step reminded him he was far from home and entirely alone, but he was not truly alone. The world had eyes. He felt them often, shapes moving in the shadows, strange growls echoing through the night. This planet was alive with predators, and he was only surviving by staying alert and clever. On this evening, he moved carefully along a rocky path when he heard something unusual. Not the growl of a beast or the whisper of the trees, but the sound of battle. Metal clashing against metal, shouts carried on the wind. His first thought was fear, but his second was curiosity. If there was battle, there were people, and if there were people, perhaps there was hope of survival. He crept closer, crouching behind a ridge of stone. His eyes widened at the sight below. In a clearing, surrounded by jagged rocks, a tall alien warrior stood. Her armor was scratched and dented, her breathing heavy. She was unlike anything Ethan had seen before. Her skin was a deep bronze, glowing faintly under the moons, and her eyes were fierce and sharp like burning amber. Her long black hair was tied back, though strands had come loose as she fought. In her hands, she held a spear, but it was broken in half, the jagged end glowing faintly with strange energy. Even with the weapon ruined, she stood proud, ready to defend herself. Around her circled predators, not of her kind, but monstrous creatures of the land. Their bodies were lean, their scales dark, their eyes glowing with hunger. They hissed and snapped, waiting for the moment to strike. Ethan's heart pounded. She was going to be torn apart. He could run, hide, and save himself. But something inside him refused. She was fighting alone, already wounded, and he could not stand by and watch her die. Without thinking, he slid down the ridge. His boots hit the dirt, and the creatures turned their heads toward him. The warrior's eyes widened in shock as she saw a human appear from the shadows. Ethan's hand fell on the broken half of the spear lying in the dirt near her. He picked it up, the weapon heavy and strange in his grip. The alien warrior shouted something in her language, but Ethan could not understand. He did not need to. The message was clear. Survive. The predators leapt. Ethan swung the broken spear, with all his strength, striking the nearest creature across its snout. It screeched and stumbled back. Another lunged at him, claws slashing. He ducked low, jabbing the jagged spearhead into its side. The weapon hummed strangely as it made contact, and the beast howled in pain. The warrior moved too, striking with the longer half of her weapon. Together, though clumsy and uncoordinated, they created a wall of defiance. Ethan shouted in raw effort, adrenaline burning through his veins. The creatures circled again, testing them, but the sudden unity of human and alien seemed to confuse them. Finally, one of the beasts snarled and backed away. The others followed, growling, before melting back into the shadows of the rocks. The clearing was silent again except for the sound of heavy breathing. Ethan stood still, his chest rising and falling, the broken spear still tight in his hand. His arms trembled with exhaustion, but he had survived. He looked at the warrior. She stared at him with unreadable eyes, her chest lifting slowly with each breath. Then, to his surprise, she lowered her weapon and gave him a bow of her head. Not deep, but sharp and deliberate. Ethan frowned. I was just helping, he muttered, though he knew she could not understand his words. What he could not know was that among her people, what he had done carried a meaning far beyond simple bravery. In her culture, to pick up a warrior's broken spear and raise it in defense of her was not just an act of aid, it was an oath of destiny. A law written in ancient times declared that whoever lifted a broken spear for a warrior became their chosen protector. It was a bond that could not be broken, The alien warrior, Princess Kaelin of the Spearborn, realized this truth at once. Her amber eyes locked on the human, and her heart thundered with disbelief. The law had been silent for generations, forgotten in peacetimes, yet now, before her, stood a stranger from the stars who had invoked it by pure chance. Ethan, brushing dirt from his hands, had no idea. To him it was simple. A stranger in danger, and he had done what any decent human should do. But to Kaelin, it was the beginning of a bond that would shake the future of her people. She spoke her name slowly, pointing to her chest. Kaelin. Ethan hesitated, then nodded, pointing to himself. Ethan. Her gaze moved to the spear in his hands. The broken weapon glowed faintly, as if it too understood the bond now forged. Kaelin's lips pressed together as she whispered words of her people's law. Ethan did not know it, but his life had just changed. What began as a crash on a forgotten world had become something much greater. He had raised her broken spear to protect her, and by doing so, without knowing, he had become her chosen one. The morning light touched the alien valley with a soft silver glow. Ethan woke slowly, his back pressed against a cold rock wall. He had not slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the glowing eyes of the predators from last night. Yet what kept his mind restless was not only fear, but the memory of the warrior princess standing before him, her amber eyes full of strength and mystery. When he opened his eyes fully, she was already awake. Princess Kaelin sat on a stone ledge, sharpening the broken edge of her spear with a steady hand. Her armor was scratched and marked with battle, yet she sat tall and calm, like a leader who carried the weight of her people. Ethan rubbed his eyes. Still alive, he whispered to himself. He had survived the night, but now came the question, what next? Kaelin's eyes lifted to him. She spoke in her language, a string of smooth but sharp words he could not understand. Ethan gave her a confused look, raising his hand slightly. I don't understand, he said simply. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then slowly she repeated only one word. Ethan. Hearing his name from her mouth startled him. He nodded. Yes. Ethan. He pointed to himself. She touched her chest. Kaelin. It was a small exchange, but it was enough to build a fragile bridge between them. Yet Ethan had no idea of the deeper storm brewing behind her calm expression. Among Kaelin's people, the law of the spear was one of the oldest traditions. It was not written in books but carried in memory, passed from elder to child. The law declared, when a warrior's spear is broken in battle and another lifts it to defend them, that person becomes the chosen protector. Their spirits are bound, by honor and fate, until death or victory breaks the chain. It was a sacred law, older than Kaelin's empire itself. Many had forgotten it in the long years of peace. Few believed it would ever be called upon again. But last night, before Kaelin's very eyes, the human had raised her broken spear and fought beside her. Her people would never ignore this. The Council of Spears would demand her obedience to the law, and Kaelin herself, though proud and strong, could not deny it. Her life was no longer only her own. By destiny, she was now tied to Ethan, but Ethan knew none of this. Later that morning, Kaelin led him down into a wider valley. Ethan followed, carrying the broken half of the spear she had left in his hands. He felt awkward, out of place, but he could not leave her side. Alone, he would not last long on this dangerous planet. As they walked, Ethan noticed strange carvings on the valley walls. Tall figures holding glowing spears were drawn into the stone. Circles, stars, and flowing lines stretched across the rock, like old stories written in pictures. Kaelin stopped in front of one carving and touched the stone with her hand. Her eyes softened, and she spoke again in her language. She pointed to the spear in Ethan's hand, then to the carving, then to him. Ethan frowned, trying to understand. This is about me? He guessed. She nodded once, firmly. Ethan let out a breath. He didn't know what story these pictures told, but one thing was clear. It had something to do with him holding that broken spear. They traveled together for hours. Along the way, Kaelin killed 2 smaller predators with swift strikes, proving her strength again and again. Ethan watched closely, learning from her movements. Though they could not speak the same language, something strange was growing between them. A rhythm, an unspoken trust. Finally, they reached a settlement hidden deep in the valley. Strange buildings shaped like stone towers with glowing crystals at their peaks stood among the cliffs. Alien banners swayed in the wind, each marked with the image of a spear. Ethan's heart lifted. Civilization. Maybe here he could find tools, maybe even a way to contact Earth. But as soon as they entered, he realized things were not that simple. The people of Kaelin's tribe gathered, their eyes wide with surprise. Murmurs rose in the crowd as they saw Ethan walking beside their princess, carrying the broken spear. Some dropped to one knee, others whispered angrily. Kaelin raised her hand, commanding silence. She spoke to them in her strong, commanding voice, explaining what had happened. Ethan stood awkwardly beside her, not understanding a word. But from the way the crowd reacted, some bowing, some glaring, he felt a cold shiver. An elder stepped forward. His armor was older, decorated with shining gems. He pointed at Ethan, then at the spear in his hands. His voice was sharp, questioning, demanding. Kaelin answered firmly, her tone carrying authority. Ethan could tell she was defending him, but the elder's eyes narrowed. Finally, the elder turned and raised his voice to the people. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others shouted in anger. Ethan's head spun. He looked at Kaelin, hoping for answers. She stepped close and said one word clearly in her accented voice. Chosen. Ethan froze. He didn't know exactly what that meant in her culture, but he could feel its weight. The way the people looked at him, the way Kaelin said it, it was not a small thing. Chosen. That night, Ethan sat near a fire in the settlement. Food was shared with him, though many still watched with suspicion. Kaelin sat beside him, her spear laid across her lap. The elder spoke long with her, pointing at Ethan often. At times, Kaelin's face hardened as if she were resisting their demands. Finally, when the elder left, Kaelin turned to Ethan. Her eyes searched his face, and she said again, Chosen. She touched her chest, then pointed at him. Then she touched the spear and back to him once more. Ethan swallowed. So, me and you? Because of this? He asked, holding up the broken spear. She nodded. Ethan leaned back, staring into the flames. He had come to this world by accident, but now, it seemed he had stepped into something far larger. These people believed he was tied to their princess by some ancient law, and from the look in Kaelin's eyes, it was not a law she could ignore. Ethan whispered to himself, What have I gotten into? He did not yet know the answer, but soon, he would learn that the title of Chosen was not just a name. It was a destiny that could change the future of her people, and his own. The next morning, the alien settlement was filled with tension. The people whispered as Ethan walked through the stone streets. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him. Some curious, some cold, some openly hostile. Children peeked from behind. Doorways pointing at the strange human who now carried the princess's broken spear. To them, he was a figure from legend. To others, he was nothing but a dangerous outsider. Ethan tried to ignore the stares, but he could feel the pressure growing heavier with every step. He had never asked to be here, and he certainly had not asked to be called Chosen. He wanted to tell them that he was just a man who had acted on instinct, but he could not speak their language, and even if he could, he suspected they would not listen. Princess Kaelin walked beside him, her head high and her expression firm. She carried herself like a leader who would not bend to the crowd's doubts. Yet inside, she too wrestled with unease. She had always trained for command, prepared for battle, and sworn to protect her people. But the law of the spear had changed everything. Now her fate was tied to this outsider, this human who did not even know their ways. The Council of Spears gathered that afternoon. It was a circle of elders, each wearing armor adorned with old battle marks and family crests. At the center of the council chamber, Kaylin stood tall with Ethan by her side. The elder who had questioned Ethan the night before rose to his feet. His name was Vayar, and his voice carried the weight of years. He pointed to Ethan and spoke in slow, heavy words. Though Ethan could not understand, he felt the challenge in the man's tone. Kaylin responded firmly, but Vayar slammed his staff against the floor, shaking the chamber. Then another elder spoke, softer but no less serious. She gestured toward Ethan, then raised her hands as if weighing scales. Finally, Kaylin turned to Ethan, her amber eyes steady. She spoke one word clearly: trials. Ethan frowned. Trials? She nodded. Then she pointed to the council, to the spear in his hand, and finally to him. Her meaning was simple enough. If he wanted to be accepted as chosen, he had to prove himself. Ethan's heart sank. He was no warrior, no soldier. He was a scientist, an explorer. But as the crowd murmured, their faces filled with doubt, Ethan knew he had no choice. If he refused, he would lose any chance of survival here. If he accepted, he might die, but at least he would do so with dignity. He took a slow breath, then nodded. "All right," he said softly, more to himself than to them. "I'll face your trials." The first trial began at dawn the next day. Ethan was led to a training ground carved into the side of a cliff. The people gathered to watch, their voices buzzing like a restless hive. At the center, he faced 3 alien warriors, each larger and stronger than him. Their spears gleamed with energy, their stances firm. Kaylin stood at the edge, her arms crossed, watching carefully. Ethan gripped the broken spear tightly. His palms were sweaty, his heartbeat wild. He had no idea how to fight like they did, but he could not back down. The trial began. The first warrior lunged forward, striking with the speed of lightning. Ethan barely managed to block, the force of the blow nearly knocking him off his feet. The crowd laughed, some jeering, some shouting insults he could not understand. Ethan stumbled back, but instead of trying to match strength with strength, he changed his approach. He had always survived through cleverness, not force. When the warrior struck again, Ethan ducked low and swung the broken spear across his opponent's legs. The warrior fell hard, surprised by the move. The crowd gasped. Ethan smiled faintly. "Not bad for a beginner," he muttered. The second warrior came next, moving cautiously. This one was faster, circling Ethan with sharp, testing jabs. Ethan's arms ached from blocking, but he noticed a pattern. The warrior favored the right side, leaving his left open. Waiting for the perfect moment, Ethan sidestepped and jabbed the broken spear forward. The blunt end struck the warrior's exposed side, knocking him back. Another gasp rippled through the crowd. Kaylin's lips curved into the smallest hint of approval. But the third warrior was different. He was larger than the others, stronger, his strikes powerful enough to shake the ground. Ethan struggled, sweat pouring down his face. The broken spear seemed far too small against such force. The warrior struck and Ethan barely rolled aside, the spearhead slamming into the dirt where he had been. Dust exploded into the air. Ethan coughed, stumbling to his feet. His arms felt like lead, his lungs burned. The warrior charged again, aiming to crush him in one blow. Ethan's eyes darted around, searching desperately. Then he saw it, a loose stone near the edge of the cliff. As the warrior swung, Ethan sidestepped, using the momentum of the blow to guide his opponent toward the stone. The warrior's foot landed on it, slipped, and his balance faltered. In that split second, Ethan thrust the broken spear forward, stopping just short of the warrior's throat. Silence fell. The warrior froze, then stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. The crowd erupted in shouts, some of surprise, some of approval, some still angry. But none could deny what they had seen. Ethan had passed the first trial. That evening, Kaylin sat with him near the fire. She handed him water from a carved stone cup and studied him carefully. "You fight different," she said slowly in broken words. Her accent was thick, but the meaning was clear. Ethan gave a tired smile. "That's because I'm not a fighter." He paused, then added softly, "I just refuse to quit." Kaylin's eyes glimmered faintly, though her face remained calm. In her heart, she felt a new respect for him. He was not strong like her people, but he carried a fire she had not expected. But the trials were not over. The next day, Ethan was tested in cunning. He was placed in a maze of stone walls filled with hidden traps. His task was to reach the center and claim a glowing crystal. While others before him had failed by relying only on speed or force, Ethan slowed down, studying each corner, each shadow. He noticed small scratches on the stone where traps had been triggered before. Using observation and patience, he avoided the dangers and reached the center safely. The crowd was silent at first, then murmured with awe. Few had ever completed the maze. Finally, the last trial came. The trial of honor. Ethan was told to face a warrior again, but this time he was given a real spear, sharp and glowing. The warrior bowed before the fight began. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. He dropped the weapon to the ground. "I don't need this," he said, even though they could not understand his words. "I won't kill to prove myself." Instead, he stood tall with only the broken spear. The warrior attacked fiercely, but Ethan defended with every ounce of determination he had. He refused to strike fatally, using the broken spear only to block and deflect. When the warrior finally lowered his weapon in exhaustion, Ethan stood still, breathing hard, but unbroken. The crowd roared, not with anger this time, but with respect. Kaylin stepped forward, her voice clear as she declared to the council that Ethan had passed. The elders looked at each other, some frowning, some nodding. But none could deny the truth. The human had faced the trials and endured. And though he did not yet understand it, Ethan had taken his first steps into becoming more than just a survivor. He was becoming a protector, a partner, and a figure who could no longer be ignored. The days after Ethan's trials were restless ones. The settlement buzzed with endless talk. Some of Kaylin's people had begun to respect the human. They whispered about his cleverness, his stubborn courage, and the strange destiny tied to the broken spear. But many others still doubted. They said he was weak, too small, and too different to protect their princess. To them, the ancient law had made a mistake. Ethan felt the weight of those eyes wherever he went. He tried to train, using the broken spear in ways that felt natural, but he knew he could never fight with the power of Kaylin's warriors. Still, he told himself, if I can't be stronger, then I'll be smarter. That thought kept him moving. Kaylin watched him quietly each day. She rarely spoke much, but there was a new light in her gaze when she looked at him. She had seen how he refused to surrender during the trials, and in her heart she began to believe the law had not chosen wrongly after all. But shadows were growing in the kingdom. Far beyond the valley settlement, rival factions stirred. Kaylin's enemies, lords who had long sought to claim her throne, had heard of the human. They laughed at the idea of an off-worlder standing as her protector. To them, it was an insult. They saw an opportunity to strike, to prove the law was nothing but weakness. And so they gathered their forces in secret, preparing for an attack. The day of the ceremony arrived. The people gathered in the great hall carved into the mountain's heart. Crystals glowed along the walls, casting golden light across the stone floor. At the center, Kaylin stood tall, dressed in ceremonial armor that gleamed like fire under the crystals. Beside her stood Ethan, holding the broken spear, its edges polished but still jagged. This was no ordinary gathering. The council had demanded a formal recognition of the law of the spear. Before all the people, Kaylin was to declare Ethan as her chosen protector. The air was thick with tension. Some cheered for Kaylin, others grumbled, shaking their heads. Ethan felt the weight of every eye on him and wished he could vanish into the shadows. The elder Veyar stepped forward, raising his staff. He spoke with a voice that filled the chamber. Though Ethan could not understand the words, the tone was clear. It was the reading of the ancient law. When Veyar finished, Kaylin placed her hand upon the broken spear. She spoke her words carefully, with pride. And then she turned to Ethan. Her eyes steady and nodded, Ethan straightened his back. He might not fully understand, but he knew this moment mattered. He tightened his grip on the spear and gave a single, strong nod in return. The people murmured, some approving, some not. But before the council could complete the ceremony, the sound of horns echoed from outside. The chamber shook with a distant roar. Cries rose in the hall as warriors rushed to the doors. Kaylin's eyes hardened. She drew her blade in one swift motion. "Enemy," she said sharply. Ethan's blood ran cold. The attack came fast. The rival faction stormed the settlement with a small army. Their armor was darker, marked with cruel symbols. They carried heavy weapons that glowed with energy. The gates of the valley burst open under their assault, and the sound of battle filled the air. Inside the great hall, the people panicked. Warriors rushed to defend, but enemy soldiers pushed through the doors, blades raised. Kaylin was the first to strike. She leapt forward with powerful grace, cutting down the invaders who dared step into the sacred chamber. Her people rallied behind her, but the enemy pressed hard, wave after wave. Ethan's heart pounded as chaos erupted. He had never stood in a real war before. His instinct screamed at him to hide. But when he saw Kaylin fighting desperately, surrounded on all sides, something inside him snapped. He lifted the broken spear. One soldier lunged at Kaylin's back. Ethan charged, striking the enemy with a wild swing. The jagged edge tore across, the soldier's armor forcing him back. Kaylin spun, her eyes flashing with surprise. Ethan shouted without words, planting himself at her side. The enemy came again. Kaylin and Ethan moved together, their rhythm rough but effective. She struck with precision, he with raw determination. When her blade drove enemies back, Ethan darted forward to block the ones who tried to circle around. When Ethan stumbled, Kaylin covered him with swift strikes. They were mismatched, yet somehow their movements fit together. The people who watched saw something unexpected. The human and their princess fighting as one. But the enemy was clever. Their leader, a tall warlord with crimson armor, forced his way into the chamber. His voice thundered, mocking Kaylin. He pointed his blade at Ethan, laughing at the sight of a human wielding a broken weapon. Kaylin's jaw tightened. She stepped forward to challenge him, but Ethan stopped her. His hands trembled, yet his voice was steady. "No," he said firmly, even though she could not understand. "If this is about me, then I'll stand." He gripped the broken spear, raising it high. The warlord sneered, then charged. His strikes were heavy, nearly crushing Ethan with every blow. Ethan stumbled back, blocking clumsily, his arms screaming with pain. But each time he fell, he rose again. Each time he staggered, he set his feet once more. The crowd cried out, watching their chosen refuse to yield. At the last moment, when the warlord swung in a wide arc, Ethan ducked low and thrust the spear upward. The jagged tip struck the warlord's chest plate, sparking with energy. The warlord roared, stumbling back. Kaylin seized the moment. With a fierce cry, she struck him down, her blade flashing bright under the crystal light. The warlord fell and his soldiers broke, retreating in fear. The chamber shook with the sound of victory. When silence finally returned, Ethan collapsed to one knee, breathless, his hand still clutching the broken spear. Kaylin stepped beside him, resting her hand on his shoulder. For the first time, she allowed a smile to touch her lips. The people, stunned by what they had seen, slowly began to bow. Not all, but many. They could no longer deny what had been proven. The human had fought, not with the strength of their warriors, but with courage that refused to break. Ethan lifted his head, meeting Kaylin's eyes. She gave him a firm nod as if to say, "Now they see what I see." Ethan exhaled, the weight of the moment sinking into him. He had not only survived the battle, he had stood beside her truly as her protector. And though he did not yet realize it, this was only the beginning. The enemies had been pushed back, but war was coming. The law of the spear had chosen him, and now the entire kingdom would be forced to accept it or be torn apart. The smoke of battle had not yet cleared when the settlement returned to uneasy silence. Broken weapons lay scattered on the ground. Crystals along the hall walls still glowed, but their light seemed dim after the clash of steel and fire. The people whispered in shock. Their princess had fought bravely as always, but it was the human who had stood at her side, refusing to fall even when faced with a warlord's blade. Ethan sat by the fire that night, his body aching with every movement. His arms were bruised, his shoulders sore, and his legs felt heavy as stone. Yet he could not forget the look on the people's faces when they saw him fight. It was no longer only doubt in their eyes. Some had shown respect, others even admiration. Kaelin sat near him, sharpening her reforged blade. She glanced at him often, her expression calm but her eyes thoughtful. She knew what he did not. His fight had stirred something ancient in the hearts of her people. At last, when the fire burned low and most of the settlement had gone to rest, Kaelin spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if the words carried more weight than any command she had given in battle. "Law," she began slowly, pointing to the spear in Ethan's hands. Ethan nodded, frowning. "Yes, I know. The law. Chosen. That word again." Kaelin shook her head. She searched for words in his language, piecing them together with effort. Not only bond, more. Secret. Old. Her voice lowered further. Ancestors. Made the law. Not for honor only. For future. For survival. Ethan leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Survival? Kaelin nodded. She gestured to the sky, above. Long ago, people strong, empire-wide. But enemies greater came. Worlds burned, ancestors prayed, law made, to call one outside. One knot of spear-born blood. Ethan froze. Her words, broken as they were, carried a meaning that shook him. The law of the spear was not only a symbol of loyalty, it was a design, an ancient safeguard. It existed to bring outsiders, aliens like him, into their people in times of greatest danger. Kaelin's eyes glimmered in the firelight. Chosen, not accident. You. Answer to law. Fate. Ethan shook his head slowly, disbelief flooding him. No. No, that can't be. I'm no savior. I'm not a warrior, not a leader. I'm just... He trailed off, his voice fading. Kaelin's gaze did not waver. You fight different. You think different. That is why law made. My people, strong but blind, need other eyes, need other fire. Her words struck deep in Ethan's chest. He remembered the trial of cunning, when he had solved the maze not with strength but with patience. He remembered the battle, when he had survived not with power but with clever moves and sheer refusal to quit. Maybe that was why the law had called him. Not to replace her people's strength, but to balance it. Still, the weight was overwhelming. Ethan looked down at the spear in his hand, its jagged edge glowing faintly as though alive. He whispered almost to himself, I never asked for this. Kaelin's expression softened for the first time. She placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. Neither did I, she said simply, but law does not ask. It chooses. The next day, the Council of Spears gathered again. The hall was filled with tense voices. Some elders praised Ethan's courage in the battle, but others shouted angrily, claiming it was madness to let an outsider hold such power. Elder Veyr rose, his voice sharp. He spoke at length, his words fast and cutting. Ethan did not understand the language, but the tone alone told him Veyr was demanding his removal. The man's eyes burned with disdain each time they landed on Ethan. Kaelin stood, her voice like iron. She spoke with force, reminding the council of the ancient law, of the prophecy written into their culture. Her words silenced some, but not all. Finally, one of the oldest elders spoke, her voice quiet but heavy with wisdom. She gestured to the broken spear, then to Ethan, then to Kaelin. Her words carried a weight that made the others fall silent. Kaelin turned to Ethan, her expression serious. They know truth now. Law. For outsider. For time of danger. But council fears. Enemies gather. War close. Ethan exhaled, his stomach tight with dread. He could see it in their eyes. The rival factions were not finished. The attack on the ceremony was only the beginning. A storm was coming, one that could tear Kalen's people apart, and somehow the law had tied him to the heart of it. That evening, Kalen took Ethan to a hidden chamber deep within the mountain. The walls glowed faintly with crystal light, and ancient carvings covered every surface. They told stories of battles long past, of heroes who fought side by side with beings not of their world. At the center of the chamber rested an altar. Upon it lay a spear, old and weathered, its shaft carved with symbols that pulsed faintly as Ethan stepped closer. Kalen bowed her head. "First spear," she said, "weapon of ancestor queen, law born here." Ethan touched the weapon gently. The air hummed around him as though the spear recognized him. For a moment he felt the presence of something greater, a history, a destiny stretching beyond his understanding. Kalen's voice broke the silence. "Enemies come soon. They will test us again, my people divided. Some will fight with me, some will fight against me, but law has chosen you, Ethan. You cannot walk away." Ethan closed his eyes. He wanted to deny it, to run, to find a way back to Earth and leave this all behind. But deep down, he knew Kalen was right. The law had pulled him into this world, for a reason. And though he did not yet believe in destiny, he believed in her. He opened his eyes and nodded slowly. "Then I'll stand with you." For the first time, Kalen allowed herself a small, true smile. "Good," she said softly, "because soon the world will need us both." Outside, the night sky stretched across the valley, stars shining bright between the two moons. But on the horizon, the glow of fires burned, far away yet growing closer. The enemy was gathering, preparing for war, and Ethan, once a stranded explorer, was no longer just a survivor. He was the chosen, bound by the law of the spear and the hoe. Secret of that law was clear. His role was not accident, but design. The storm was coming, and this time he would face it not alone, but side by side with the warrior princess whose fate was now bound to his. The night before the final battle was quiet, too quiet. The valley settlement that had always been alive with the sounds of training, voices and song now rested in heavy silence. Fires burned low and shadows stretched long against the stone walls. Warriors sharpened their weapons with grim focus. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers of safety. Everyone knew what was coming. Ethan sat near one of the fires, the broken spear across his lap. His hands brushed along its jagged edge, feeling the hum of its strange energy. He had come to this world by accident, but now he sat at the center of its future. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any weapon. Kalen approached quietly, her armor already strapped, her hair tied back. She looked calm, but Ethan could see the storm in her eyes. She sat beside him, resting her hand briefly on the spear before pulling it back. "Tomorrow," she said simply. Ethan nodded. He didn't need translation. He could see the fear in the people, the glow on the horizon, the endless whispers of scouts returning with grim news. The enemy army was vast, far larger than the raiding party they had fought before. They were coming not just to strike fear, but to end Kalen's line forever. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The crackle of the fire was the only sound. Then Kalen spoke again, slower, her voice carrying a softness Ethan rarely heard from her. "My father," she hesitated, then continued. "He say once, law of spear, not only protection, it is joining. Two paths become one. Not command, not chain, but choice." Ethan turned to her, surprised. "Choice?" She nodded. "You raised spear without knowing law. That was choice. Tomorrow, you fight again. That must also be choice." Her eyes held his, steady and strong. "If you stand with me, Ethan, not because law says, because you believe." Ethan looked at her, then down at the broken spear glowing faintly in his hands. He thought of everything he had endured, the crash, the predators, the trials, the jeers of the council, the battle where he nearly fell. Through all of it, one thing had remained the same. He had never turned his back when someone needed him. Slowly, he raised his head. "I'll fight with you, not because of your law, because I want to, because it's right." For the first time, Kalen's lips curved into a true warm smile. "Then tomorrow, we fight together." The dawn came with the sound of horns. The enemy army marched across the horizon, their banners dark, their weapons shining with deadly light. Dust rose in thick clouds under their feet, their voices carried in the wind, a roar of defiance that shook the valley. Kalen's warriors formed ranks outside the settlement gates. Spears glowed, shields locked, and banners of the spear were raised high. Kalen herself stood at the front, tall and unshaken, her presence a pillar of strength for all who followed her. Beside her stood Ethan, the broken spear in his hands. The people whispered his name now, not with doubt but with belief. The outsider who had survived the trials, the human who had fought in the hall, the man who carried their princess's broken spear. The enemy halted before them. Their warlord stepped forward, a towering figure in crimson armor. His voice thundered across the valley, mocking Kalen and her human protector. His army laughed, certain of their victory. Kalen raised her blade, her voice ringing clear. She shouted to her people, a speech of courage, of unity. Though Ethan could not understand the words, he felt them in his chest. He saw how her people's eyes brightened, how their fear melted into fire. When she finished, Ethan stepped forward, raising the broken spear high above his head. The crowd gasped. He took a breath and shouted in his own tongue, "We stand together." They did not understand his words, but they understood the meaning. A roar rose from the ranks. The battle began. The clash was thunderous. Enemy soldiers stormed forward, their weapons blazing. Kalen's warriors met them head-on, shields bracing, spears stabbing. The valley shook with the force of combat. Kalen moved like a storm, her blade cutting through enemy after enemy. Ethan stayed close, blocking attacks, striking where he could. He was not as fast or strong as her warriors, but his stubbornness kept him on his feet. When Kalen was surrounded, he was there, striking with desperate energy to give her space. When Ethan stumbled, she cut down those who threatened him. Their bond was not perfect, but it was real. Together they became more than two fighters, they became one force. At the center of the battle, the crimson-armored warlord charged again. His voice boomed as he raised his weapon, pointing it at Ethan. This time he would not settle for wounding. He wanted the human destroyed. Ethan braced himself, fear pounding in his chest. The warlord's strikes came like hammers, each one rattling his bones. He blocked, dodged, rolled, refusing to give in. But he knew he could not last forever. Kalen saw his struggle. She fought her way through, her blade flashing, and came to his side. Together they faced the warlord, one with a broken spear, the other with a shining blade. The warlord laughed. "A princess and her pet," he roared in his own tongue. But his laughter ended when Ethan darted forward, striking not at his armor but at his footing. The broken spear dug into the ground at the warlord's feet, tripping him for a moment. Kalen seized the chance. With a fierce cry, she leapt and struck, her blade slicing across his chest. The warlord stumbled, roaring in fury. Ethan followed, slamming the broken spear into the crack Kalen had opened. The weapon pulsed with strange energy, as if the ancient law itself lent power to the strike. The warlord fell to his knees. Kalen raised her blade high and finished it, her strike clean and final. Silence fell across the battlefield. The enemy army wavered, their leader gone. Some tried to fight on, but Kalen's warriors roared forward, driving them back. Soon the valley was filled only with the cries of victory. The enemy broke, retreating into the horizon. When the dust cleared, the people gathered in the valley. Their banners rose high, their voices shouted Kalen's name and Ethan's. For the first time, no one doubted him. Kalen stood before her people, her blade at her side. She turned to Ethan and dropped to one knee, bowing her head in the ancient sign of respect. The crowd gasped in shock. She rose and spoke loudly, pointing to Ethan. Her words carried through the valley. "Not only chosen by law, chosen by choice. The people cheered, their voices rising like thunder. Ethan stood still, the broken spear heavy in his hands. Slowly, he lifted it high, his voice breaking with emotion. "I swear, I will protect you, always." Though the people did not understand the words, they felt the vow in his voice, and Kaelin understood. She nodded once, her amber eyes shining with pride. From that day on, Ethan was no longer just a stranded human. He was the protector of the princess, the chosen one not only by the law of the spear but by his own oath. And together, side by side, they would lead her people into a future stronger than the past, two different worlds joined by courage, trust, and a broken spear raised in defiance.